Well, hello, church history friends. My name is Barb Walden, and I'm excited to welcome you tonight to our fourth lecture in the fall lecture series. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you are as excited as I am to hear the fascinating stories of RLDS feminist activism in the 1970s. Well, joining me today is my co-host, Peter Smith. Peter is a board member for the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation, and he's also co-director of our annual Historic Sites bus tours. Friends, if you haven't lived unless you have traveled on a 10-day bus tour with Peter. It's really an exciting opportunity, and I look forward to it every year. In addition to Peter, Lexi Frazier is joining us tonight as a co-host. Lexi is a former student intern in the Alma Blair internship program, and she's joining us tonight from Ohio. Welcome, Lexi. It's good to see you. I'm also thrilled to announce our annual fall campaign began this week, and you, our friends in the audience, have the opportunity to be among the very first people to give to the annual campaign. Donations received throughout the end of the year will support the ongoing maintenance and preservation expenses of all 5 Community of Christ historic sites. As you know, located in Kirtland, Ohio, Nauvoo, and Plano, Illinois, historic Lamoni, Iowa, and Independence, Missouri. And in addition to your generous gifts, it will help fund young adults serving in the Alma Blair internship program, which is truly a life-changing program for young adults who serve at the Kirtland Temple and the Joseph Smith Historic Site. So giving to the fall campaign supports our online programs, just like tonight's lecture, in addition to the winter book series and special events that we host throughout the year. Your generosity truly makes a difference, and I hope you'll consider a donation to this annual campaign.
I'm happy to share that the Foundation's Board of Directors will match your donation for the first $15,000 in donations received. That means if you give a $100 donation, the Board of Directors will make it $200. A $1,000 gift will become $2,000 gift to support the historic sites. Isn't that wonderful?
That is wonderful. And Peter is one of those generous board members, and I'm so glad he's here tonight to share about this matching gift opportunity. So friends, if you're interested in supporting the ongoing preservation efforts at these significant places of Latter-day Saint heritage, follow the QR code that you see on the screen. Lexi will also drop the online donation link and mailing address into the chat for anybody who wishes to donate tonight. So thank you all, church history friends, for your continuing support. We really couldn't do programs like this without you. And speaking of exciting programs, there's another happening coming up, and our friends at Liberty Hall will host their annual Christmas tea on Sunday, December 10th. The afternoon includes a number of musicians and choirs. There's a lot to look forward to. If you haven't been to the Liberty Hall Christmas tea, make this your year. The board of directors visited Lamoni last week. We were able to get a sneak peek of some of the decorations there at Liberty Hall, and it really is incredible. It's just a phenomenal site anyway, but to see it all decorated for the Christmas holiday is really, really special. So everyone is welcome to the Christmas tea, and it's going to take place between 2 and 4 on Sunday, December 10th. So please make it to Lamoni if you live nearby. Joining us tonight are 2 great historians, Nancy Ross and David Howlett. Nancy is a department chair and associate professor in the interdisciplinary arts and science department at Utah Tech University, where she has been teaching for 16 years. Her PhD is in art history, but her current research focuses on the history and sociology of religion. She's an ordained elder in Community of Christ and serves as pastor of the Southern Utah congregation. We're so happy you're with us tonight, Nancy. In addition to Nancy, we have David Howlett, who is likely a familiar face. He's shared with us a couple of times, and we're thrilled that he's back. David is the Mellon Visiting Assistant Professor of Religion at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. Dr. Howlett earned a BSE from the University of Central Missouri, an MA from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and a PhD from the University of Iowa. He's a specialist in American religions and has taught at Kenyon College, Skidmore College, and Bowdoin College. His published works include The Kirtland Temple, the biography of a shared Mormon sacred space, which we took a look at during the summer series a few years ago. It's a wonderful book. And he's also co-authored the book Mormonism, The Basics, which came out in 2017. David is one of 3 official church historians for Community of Christ, and he holds the priesthood office of elder. So welcome, Nancy. Welcome, David. So excited you're here. I'll turn things over to you as we are all ready to hear about RLDS women and their activism throughout the 1960s and 70s.
Thanks for that introduction, Barb. So we also wanted to say, we're going to start off, I'm going to read the first half of the talk, and then I'll switch and I'll be the slide runner, and then Nancy will read the second half. I've noticed already that there are folks who have logged in that know this history because they lived through it and were historical participants in it. So we welcome any questions and corrections and further information because we're all learning about this. So thanks for everyone for joining us tonight. So here we go with the talk now. Sometimes I almost cry at ordination services, wrote Carolyn Reiser in a 1972 editorial. I look around the congregation at some of my sisters who have performed all kinds of family ministry and individual counseling, who have deep understandings of Christ's example of loving service, whose lives testify of loving service. Yet these sisters, because they are women, cannot officially serve in a church which would not exist except for their loving efforts. Reiser was not alone in this critique. Over the course of the 1970s, feminists in her denomination created grassroots organizations to combat what Reiser termed, quote, the patriarchal legacy of our culture, unquote, that permeated their local congregations. Yet, Reiser and her fellow feminists did not belong to one of the many mainline Protestant denominations. Instead, they were part of the Midwestern based denomination, which many people are part of that are on this call, at the time called the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, RLDS. In the 1970s and early 1980s, RLDS feminists produced an efflorescent religious feminism in their church, particularly around the contentious issue of women's ordination. In this talk, we'll focus on this era, the 70s, but first we're going to give some background, and starting with the 1830s and work our way through successive eras of RLDS feminism. One of the first ways in which late 19th century Latter-day Saint women advocated for change was by reminding the rest of the church that Emma Smith had been ordained and had a calling. The Nauvoo Minute Book for the Female Relief Society, which is online as part of the Joseph Smith Papers Project, references Emma's ordination, noting that Emma did not need ordination to be the president of the Relief Society because it had already happened. So LDS feminist scholar Margaret Toscano argues that Emma was ordained in both 1842 and 1843, though Lachlan Mackay argues that that happened in 1830 as part of a revelation for Emma Smith being the elect lady. The Mormon women's newspaper, The Women's Exponent, which ran from 1872 to 1914, printed and reprinted the story of Emma's ordination over and over again. So what about the RLDS Church? Well, the RLDS Church, reorganized in the 1850s after the 1840s Nauvoo diaspora, expanded roles for women beyond their Nauvoo era bounds. Women in local congregations formed their own ladies' aid societies, though some male priesthood leaders believed that such groups encouraged women to act outside of their appropriate sphere. The Saints Herald, an RLDS publication, created a Mother's Home column in 1886, written by and under the control of Marietta Walker. While Walker generally filled her column with recipes and household management advice, she also successfully advocated for women's voting rights at what was then called the General Conference, later, of course, called the World Conference. Late 19th century RLDS leaders and members alike lived within a religious culture alive with spiritual gifts like speaking in tongues, faith healing, and prophecy. By the 1890s, some members began to affirm women's religious authority through these charismatic gifts. In the Pacific Slope Mission of California, High Priest D.S. Mills ordained Emma Burton to give administrations of healing of the sick to women. Outraged opponents saw this as an ordination of Burton to the priesthood. When Bishop E.L. Kelly asked Mills for an explanation, Mills wrote, quote, "What I have said and done in that matter was by the power of the Holy Spirit, and I can't go back on that," unquote. Apostle T.W. Smith, the supervisor of the Pacific Slope Mission, directly responded to this incident, indicating that women could not hold priesthood office. Several RLDS members strongly reacted to Smith's prohibition. Sister E.G. Hodge, an old Nauvoo saint, wrote a letter published in the Mother's Home column saying, quote, "I do not like to hear them say that women cannot hold the priesthood or do this or do that. Are we not all one in Christ Jesus?" Unquote. The issue came up again in April 1905, when a proposed resolution at General Conference, later World Conference, sought to obtain ordination for women working with the Zion's Religio Society, a Book of Mormon reading group for church youth at the time. It's the kind of predecessor to the Zion's League. As clergy received discounted train fares, women's ordination would have had practical value. The issue was referred to the First Presidency and the Council of 12 Apostles, who reported that new revelations would be required for such a break from tradition, and that in the absence of such revelations, they could not support women's ordination. Questions about women's ordination, though, would not go away. Even as the 19th Amendment granted white women voting rights, Protestant women lobbied for equal opportunities in their churches. For example, building on previous attempts, in the 1920 General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church, the International Association of Women's Ministers, the IAWM, sent a petition to the Methodist Episcopal General Church's General Conference to approve ecclesiastical equality for women, but this was unsuccessful. In the 1924 General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church, women secured ordination as lay preachers, but not full clergy rights. So there's some context. A 1920 editorial in the Saints Herald reported on ordination debates in other churches, particularly within the Presbyterian Church. Editor Sam Burgess took the occasion to comment on the prospects of women's ordination in the RLDS Church. Burgess indicated that RLDS scripture did not prohibit women from ministry or ordination, but that ordination of women would require, quote, "a change in the constitution of the church," unquote. By the 1930s, there was this broader movement within Protestant churches, the deaconess movement. It was beginning its slow decline by the 30s, but RLDS President Fred M. Smith considered the possibility of creating such an order within the RLDS Church itself. In 1936, Smith stated at a women's gathering that he was considering, quote, "ordaining deaconesses to an order of Dorcas." At the time, some Protestant deaconesses and their supporters had begun to advocate for the full ordination of women. Most deaconesses, by the way, were a separate order that were not fully ordained. So then deaconesses in these Protestant churches were beginning to argue that there should be full ordination for women too. So that's the context for Smith then talking about an order of deaconesses within the RLDS Church. Nevertheless, while Smith confided in his protege, Garland Tickmeyer, that women would someday be ordained to the priesthood. So here, F.M. Smith says that, yes, women will be ordained someday to the full priesthood, not just an order of deaconesses. Despite that, open advocacy for women's ordination would not happen again among RLDS for the next 35 years. A generation after the ordination controversies of the 1920s and 19-teens, a number of mainline Protestant denominations rapidly accepted the practice. Northern and Southern Presbyterians did so in 1956 and 1965. And then some Northern Methodists did so in 56, some Lutherans in 1970, and Episcopalians, the last of the major mainline churches to ordain women, did so in 1976. Concurrent with the rise of second-wave feminism, activists formed small grassroots organizations in a number of denominations to advocate for the ordination of women. Some women from these smaller groups joined larger ecumenical organizations, like the IAWM, the International Association of Women Ministers, or Church Women United, CWU, that engaged in advocacy work. As these mainline Protestant institution-centered churches moved to ordain women, the RLDS Church engaged in the process of discerning women's ordination as well. In April 1970, a handful of liberal RLDS faculty members at RLDS-owned Graceland College, now of course Graceland University, founded Courage, a journal of history, thought, and action. That same month, delegates at the World Conference, the renamed General Conference, discussed a resolution that addressed women's underrepresentation on church committees. The Australian delegation presented an alternative motion that affirmed women's leadership and asked church leadership to clarify its position on women's ordination. Delegates, however, voted to table the Australian delegation's resolution. In a Courage editorial later that year, the board identified two significant problems in the church: women's inequality and, quote, a shortage of priesthood manpower, unquote. Others expressed concern that the full talent of the church was not being employed due to the male-only priesthood. Another advocate, Carolyn Reiser, who we quoted in the very beginning, posed the question, why do women want to be in the priesthood? And noted, quote, some women involved in the emerging women's rights movement within the church would say, we don't. She explained that some women associated the priesthood with authoritarianism and therefore did not wish to join it. During the 1970s and early 1980s, women's ordination was a frequent topic of debate at World Conference. Church leadership continued to state that the barriers to women's ordination were not theological, but in the words of one First Presidency member, a matter of sociology and tradition. And of course, as some of you know, part of that tradition was W. Wallace Smith saying he didn't support it. But nevertheless, some of his other members of the First Presidency affirmed that it was just a matter of sociology and tradition. A more conservative faction disagreed then with this idea of it's just about sociology and tradition. This conservative faction argued that male-only priesthood was theologically necessary. RLDS fundamentalist Richard Price, a publisher eventually, for instance, he published Saints at the Crossroads in 1974. And within Saints at the Crossroads, which was a protest against what they saw as liberalization of the church, there was a substantial section warning readers about women's ordination. Even as conservative RLDS members feared women's ordination, some feminists left the RLDS church because progress was too slow on this issue as well. So let's talk about an emerging group that comes out of this. A group which will eventually have a name called AWARE was a long-lived RLDS feminist group that engaged in both consciousness raising and advocacy. It began in the mid-1970s and ceased meeting in the late 1990s. When it began in the mid-70s, AWARE was initially known as the Group Without a Name, perhaps a nod to Betty Friedan's description of the problem that has no name in the feminist mystique. Lois Braby, who helped found a faculty feminist consciousness-raising group at Graceland in 1969, another consciousness-raising group called the Lamoni Women's Liberation Group, she was a supporter of AWARE. Now, Braby reflected that, quote, several of us were concerned about the lack of power roles in the RLDS church, and we began to take initiative and make open attempts to change the system. Through its existence, the Group Without a Name, later called AWARE, drafted and redrafted statements of purpose for their group, doing so through a consensus-seeking process common among other feminist consciousness-raising groups in the US. One statement from the early 1980s stated that the then named AWARE was, quote, to be a network of support by sharing our pain, anger, hope, and joy through worship and celebration, to explore theology, our common feminist heritage, and current issues. 3, to raise our consciousness of our own behavior and encourage growth in ourselves. 4, to develop a power base for action on feminist and social issues. 5, to create shared leadership and responsibility. Another statement from the same era emphasized that the group had no structural hierarchy, but engaged in, quote, a free-flowing process with shared and changing responsibilities within the group. So let's talk more about the group. The group itself came into existence through the work of 2 recent college graduates, Mary Lou Goodyear and Joni Shoemaker, who had participated in a Graceland College student consciousness-raising group. So we mentioned the Lamoni Women's Liberation group. Well, there was also a student group that was parallel to that at Graceland that grew out of the faculty group. So these 2 students, Mary Lou Goodyear and Joni Shoemaker, were part of it. They wanted to start a broader-based group. So in the summer of 1975, Goodyear and Shoemaker sent out invitations to 35 women for a meeting at Goodyear's parents' home in Independence, Missouri. On July 12, 1975, 19 women from, basically it was from Colorado, Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, Michigan, Nebraska thrown in there too. 19 women then met for 6 hours to discuss a proposed letter to the Joint High Council, the highest leadership group in the RLDS Church. In a recent oral history, Mary Lou Goodyear speculated that her mother, Imogene Goodyear, and RLDS Church archivist Madeline Brunson drafted the document, though she could not be sure. So she read over it and said, this is a lot like what Madeline or Imogene might write. She thought it was actually Madeline who was writing a lot of it. So here's the proposed letter. And we'll read to you some of the preamble of it. Quote, this letter is written on behalf of all women in the church who, by virtue of their sex, have been indiscriminately omitted from full participation within the church structure. We write not to ask that another study committee, minor appointment, or token slot be filled by one of the many qualified women church members, but that a true revision in structure take place so that no one who is recognized as qualified and willing to perform tasks be overlooked for a biological reason. We call the church into accountability for its stance on the personhood of all souls. God has always desired to work with an individual in any manner in which that person is willing and potentially qualified. If the church is truly to become a representative world council, it must not countenance a hierarchy which is exclusively white, male, and middle class. In order to become a community of believers, women, non-white, poor, and rich must be allowed to function in all phases of church life: pastoral care positions, outreach growth positions, positions of authority, etc. The letter continued by referencing scriptures from Doctrine and Covenants 119:8b, which begins with all are called, and section 151:9a, a more recent section, which references the worth of all persons. Then the women who jointly wrote this letter and talked about it ended their letter with a charge to the council, the Joint High Council. They said, quote, join us in realizing the limitations of your social conditioning and ours, and help us emerge into a new stage in history. We wish to be more than handmaidens. We are individuals who are capable of participating in the totality of church life. This bold letter didn't pull any punches, but drew on the language of RLDS scripture to make a robust case for the full inclusion and participation of women in the life of the church. While the letter did not ask for women's ordination specifically, it pointed to the need for it by making the argument that the current system of exclusion did not live up to the church's values, as outlined in scripture. Thus, in their very first meeting, the group without a name, formed by consciousness-raising group veterans, began to discuss how deep structural changes might be affected within their denomination. Now, we're going to switch and Nancy's going to talk, and I'm going to take over the slides.
The 1970s was awash in the women's ordination debate in the United States and around the globe, and RLDS women were aware of these developments. The minutes of a March 30th, 1976 meeting of the emerging RLDS feminist group noted that some objected to the name, a group without a name, and they thought it sounded like an underground organization. By this time, the group was informally calling itself the RLDS Women's Caucus. One participant declared, "We are a social movement," during the meeting, connecting the work of this group to other women's advocacy groups in other denominations. The RLDS Women's Caucus outlined a number of goals as recorded in the minutes of the meeting. These goals included educating, quote, the church membership about the status of women in the church, emphasizing the ultimate value of persons regardless of sex, supporting group members struggling with not being valued by the church, and researching concepts related to the status of women in the church. And under this last goal, there were several comments and questions relating to women and the priesthood. And the minute taker of this meeting recorded that the group should investigate the ways of getting, quote, ways of getting at power without dealing with priesthood. And then asked, is there any power in the church structure other than priesthood, close quote. Members of the RLDS Women's Caucus were aware of the difficulty of tackling the issue of women and ordination directly, and as their previous letter demonstrated, preferred to address the low status of women in the church and the need to fix that instead of seeking ordination directly. In advance of the 1976 World Conference, the RLDS Women's Caucus requested space for a women's social and informational gathering as part of the conference, but were denied by church leaders. Instead, they rented space at Palmer Junior High School and planned to hold their gathering there. They asked church leaders if they could put up notices for their meeting on the auditorium notice boards about their meeting, but they were denied access. Marilou Goodyear recalled that Madeline Brunson suggested that they put their notices about their women's meeting in the women's bathrooms at World Conference, where priesthood leaders would not see them. Lois Braby remembered a large and successful gathering with more than 100 women in attendance, though both men and women also showed up to protest the meeting and were asked to leave. At that meeting, RLDS feminists from across the US planned to start affiliate organizations in California, Oregon, Washington, Iowa, Kansas, Florida, and Colorado, though most of the affiliated chapters did not materialize in the coming years. By the end of the 1970s, the RLDS Women's Caucus was searching for a new name. And earlier notes from Marge Troe suggested that the group had considered, perhaps as a joke, Pandora's Organization for Women, or POW, but they did not go in that direction. Instead, they landed on the name AWARE, which stood for Awake, Worship, Action, Renewal, and Education. And in doing so, the group signaled that they would continue the dual emphasis on consciousness raising and advocacy work. Unlike so many Christian women's programming at the time, former Herald editor Barbara Howard, an AWARE participant, remembered that, quote, the classes that we had were not on how to make a better bed or how to cook a better meal. They were all about your mind and your gifts, close quote. One particular retreat featured a memorable speaker, Peggy Ann Way, who was an ordained woman in the United Church of Christ, or UCC. Howard remembers hearing a passage from this speaker that encouraged her to, quote, be assertive, but also use your gifts. Find a place in the church where they will need your gifts and get in there and use those gifts, because if you pull away, the church will never change, close quote. For the AWARE women, these consciousness-raising messages were essential for their personal transformation. Howard also remembered that AWARE encouraged participants to advocate for women at the congregational level. She said that the, quote, AWARE group kept pushing. In whatever congregation you were in, AWARE members were supposed to try to get up on that pulpit and say a prayer, read a scripture, or do something that didn't mean you had to be ordained to get up there in front of people, close quote. AWARE women, numbering no more than 30 to 40 at any given time, pursued the work of consciousness raising and advocacy training. The group did this through monthly meetings and yearly retreats. At these women-only gatherings, they circulated and discussed feminist books or short articles. They shared reading lists on feminist theology, cribbed from the syllabi of college courses they had taken or taught. They organized to support local women running for public office. They created action plans to advocate for equal pay for women who worked for the church. They planned conferences that explored broadly women's issues in religion. They wrote letters, as you can see on our screen, expressing their solidarity with Sonia Johnson, a prominent excommunicated feminist in the LDS Church. Beyond their meetings, aware women joined ecumenical organizations like Churchwomen United, found and staffed a shelter for women who had been victims of domestic violence, the first of its kind in their area. I believe that's in Independence, and created women-centered liturgy using inclusive language. They ran retreats at which they preached and performed sacrament-like rituals without the sanction of ordination. Aware women and their allies challenged the hierarchical nature of priesthood itself, though they did so with varying ideas about the value of women's ordination for the church. As early as 1972, Carolyn Reiser summed up the feelings of some RLDS feminists who did not want women's ordination, since for them, quote, priesthood had lost any valid function it may have had and now exists as an authoritarian structure fostering unquestioning, unthinking obedience to the voice of the priesthood as the final authority, close quote. More typical was the response of RLDS feminists who wanted a transformed egalitarian priesthood, and if that goal seemed remote, a church in their present that centered on the capabilities of laity for ministry, with priesthood officiating only in sacraments. Some of the women in Aware were married to men in prominent RLDS leadership positions. However, many participants were also rank-and-file churchwomen, consistent with how successful ordination movements typically involved a combination of elite and grassroots support. Ultimately, Aware women not only advocated for women's ordination, but also practiced non-hierarchical models of leadership described in articles published by Courage. In 1979, RLDS Women's Commissioner and Aware member Marjorie Troe represented the church on the National Board for Churchwomen United, an ecumenical organization that connected Troe to those who were doing similar kinds of advocacy work in other denominations. RLDS women became involved with Churchwomen United at the local and national levels. Churchwomen United, too, had become a much more activist organization in the 1970s compared to its more apolitical stance in the previous decades. Consequently, RLDS women found their activism energized by their association with Churchwomen United. By the early 1980s, the campaign for women's ordination within the RLDS Church had spread throughout the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom and Canada. For example, women were being called to the priesthood in local Australian and New Zealand congregations, but their calls were not approved by the RLDS First Presidency. Frustrated by this situation, Australian and New Zealand delegates at the 1980 World Conference proposed a solution authorizing women's ordination in their local jurisdictions, even if it did not happen in the larger RLDS Church. Their resolution failed. In 1984, Sharon Welch, a longtime member of Aware and newly hired assistant professor of theology at Harvard Divinity School, led an Aware retreat at a Benedictine abbey in northern Missouri. By then, RLDS feminists had been advocating for more than a decade for goals that were congruent with the emerging women church groups in the Catholic Church. At that retreat, RLDS women tried to enact this vision, allowing all to participate in the serving of communion, a violation of common RLDS practices in which only priesthoods served the sacrament. Feminist groups in other parts of the church had enacted the same transgressive ritual for several years, including an all-women's congregation in Michigan. Though the church hierarchy had long identified revelation as the best path forward for women's ordination, no such revelation had been forthcoming from the First Presidency, until the 1984 World Conference, when church leaders presented the long-awaited document. Some church members were jubilant. Becky Savage, who was present at the reading of the new revelation that became Section 156 of the Doctrine and Covenants, wrote, quote, "I can confirm the overwhelming, stunned silence that permeated the conference chamber when the document was read to the unordained delegates. The second most predominant emotion was joy, and for many, this elation continued several months later," close quote. Others, however, had more mixed responses. Marlene Kruger, who had worked in the music and women's departments, was overwhelmed and did not want additional church responsibilities. RLDS feminists, who'd been exploring the elimination of the patriarchal hierarchy in a women's church model, had a different critique. For them, women's ordination felt like a concession instead of a victory. Barbara Higdon, president of Graceland College, reflected on her immediate response years later, wondering if she would accept a call to priesthood with integrity. Archivist Madeline Brunson likewise expressed ambivalence and wrote that she felt depressed that the hierarchical church structure would remain intact. While the 1984 World Conference approved women's ordination, the first ordinations did not happen until November 1985, when 100 ordinations took place, with hundreds following the next year. Susan Score reported that many women faced local opposition, not unlike what took place in other denominations. Yet a growing number of women's ordinations made the denomination stand out among American churches. RLDS priesthood statistics from 1996 show that women made up about 27% of all priesthood in the global church. By comparison, in 1994, the United Church of Christ had the highest percentage of women clergy of any mainline Protestant church at 25%, a little bit lower, with many mainline Protestant denominations sitting at 10 to 12% of their clergy as women. In the almost 40 years since the first RLDS ordinations in 1985, the social significance of women's ordination came into sharper focus as denominations took women's ordination as a sign of which side a group took in America's culture wars. By the 1990s, America's largest Protestant denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, had retracted its policies that had allowed for women's ordination as senior pastors. Reflecting on such developments, sociologist Mark Chaves explained that American denominations often utilized women's ordination, quote, as symbolic display to the outside world, close quote, on their collective position toward liberalism within modernity. Quote, to resist gender equality, stated Chaves, was and to resist that project. While church leaders and scholars have expressed concerns over the number of those who left in the wake of women's ordination, David Howlett and I believe that this change saved the RLDS Church by allowing many more capable adults to join the ranks of church leadership at the local level and more broadly. Many RLDS women celebrated the victory of the 1984 decision, but others viewed this change as a concession to patriarchal hierarchy rather than as a real win for real equality. Today, 6 of the members of the Council of 12 Apostles are women, as is one of the 3 members of the First Presidency and one of the presiding bishop, Rick. Women serve at all levels of leadership throughout the church, and many expect that the next prophet president of Community of Christ will be a woman. We will soon find out. So while this has been a big history lesson, I think that there are a few things that we can take away from our bigger story. And the first is that institutional change takes a lot of grassroots work over a sustained period of time. The acceptance of Section 156 of the Doctrine and Covenants brought about this change in 1984, but the Australia and New Zealand mission centers asked for this change beginning in 1970. And as we had noted, others asked for it even before then. But between Australia and New Zealand asking for this change, and the eventual change in 1984, there is a 14-year gap. So nothing happened overnight. And the second big takeaway here is that many of the women who were advocating for change were married to men at all levels of leadership. Male church leaders had good reason to listen to their wives. So thank you for joining our presentation this evening.
Oh, well, I am so sad that we are going to bring tonight to a close. This has been such a fabulous night. Thank you so much, Nancy and David. What a night. Whew. You've given us a lot to think about. And thank you for joining us for this evening from Utah and Massachusetts to share your continuing research on RLDS women's activism. It seems like even what we've received in the chats and what people have shared tonight is just more material in this treasure trove that you're collecting. And I'm so excited about what you two are doing. So I hope you'll keep us posted, maybe come back at some point to let us know about the new research you're doing and any way that we can help. Also, big thank you to Peter and Lexi for helping out behind the scenes and making it all look so easy as they do week after week. And I also want to share our thanks to all of you, our dear church history friends in the audience, for your generous support for the fall campaign and your continuing love for church heritage and a good story. You are such good company on Thursday nights. Thank you, thank you. Now, I encourage you all to tune in for our next lecture, which will take place on Giving Tuesday. That's Tuesday, November 28th at 7 p.m. We'll hear the latest research on the daguerreotype that was shared last year. Locke Mackay will be our guest historian, and his lecture is called Update on the 1840s Smith-Larson daguerreotype. So follow the link that Lexi will drop into the chat to register for that lecture. Again, happening on Giving Tuesday, November 28th at 7 p.m. Don't forget, it's Tuesday, not Thursday. So until then, we wish you all a warm and wonderful Thanksgiving holiday. Keep reading your church history and have a blessed night.